In the high plains of Montana in the autumn of 1921, people saw something that made them stop their wagons and stare. A woman, a newcomer named Anna Olson, was building a long, low tunnel. It snaked from the back door of her small cabin to the main door of her barn, a distance of maybe 70 feet. It wasn't made of wood or sod, it was made of canvas, stretched over a skeleton of bent saplings. Travelers on the county road slowed down. They pointed. Neighbors rode over, ostensibly to check in, but really to get a better look at the strange white caterpillar hugging the frozen ground. They thought she'd lost her mind. A canvas tunnel? In a land where the wind could peel the bark from a tree? It was madness. It was a joke. And when the winter of 1922 hit with a fury that old-timers still talk about, with relentless winds and temperatures that shattered century-old records, that crazy canvas tunnel would prove the difference between survival and surrender. If you want to see the number that made the most experienced rancher in the valley go silent, the number that proved this widow understood something fundamental about winter that everyone else had missed, stay until the end. What did the sailmaker's daughter understand about heat, wind, and work that every hardened plainsman had gotten wrong? If you enjoy stories of quiet competence and forgotten wisdom, consider subscribing and drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Anna Olson wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. She was a 34-year-old widow trying to keep herself and her 8-year-old son, Thomas, alive. She had come to Montana the year before with her husband, Lars, who had bought a small quarter section with the last of their savings. He'd built a solid, conventional cabin. By frontier standards, it was more than respectable. It was tightly chinked, had a good fieldstone fireplace, and a new cast-iron stove that could hold a fire through the night. Lars had known his business, but a falling tree during a summer storm had taken him, leaving Anna with a cabin, a barn, a few head of cattle, and a son to raise in a land that didn't know her name. Her first winter, the winter of 1921, was her brutal education. It wasn't just the cold, it was the wind, a constant, scouring force that came down from the north and never seemed to stop. The cabin itself was tight, but survival wasn't lived entirely indoors. The firewood was in the barn. The 2 milk cows and their calf were in the barn. The feed, the tools, the well pump handle she had to bring inside each night to keep it from freezing solid. All of it required that 70-foot journey from house to barn. That winter, the trip became a gauntlet. Every morning, she would bundle herself and Thomas in every layer they owned. They'd open the cabin door, and the heat they had spent all night building would be violently sucked out, replaced by an Arctic blast that would send papers flying and extinguish the lantern on the table. The temperature inside would plummet 10 degrees in 30 seconds. Then came the walk. The wind, often blowing at 40 miles per hour, would drive snow into their faces with the force of sand. It was physically exhausting. She'd stumble into the barn, her face numb, her hands aching, her body's precious warmth stripped away. She'd do the morning chores, milking, feeding, checking the animals, all in a bone-aching chill. Then she'd have to load up with firewood for the cabin stove. On the return trip, carrying an armload of wood, she couldn't shield her face. The wind would tear at her eyes, making them water until the tears froze to her cheeks. She'd get back to the cabin, stumble inside, and another wave of frigid air would invade their living space. It was a cycle of heat loss. 4, 5, sometimes 6 times a day. Open the door, lose the heat. Walk through the wind, lose body heat. Open the door again, lose more heat. Her son, Thomas, was constantly sick with a deep, rattling cough. He slept in his coat and hat. Anna stuffed rags along the baseboards every evening, only to find them frozen stiff by morning. She was burning through their woodpile at an alarming rate. By February, she was terrified it wouldn't last. She had calculated 4 cords for the winter. By March, she was well into her 5th. One evening, while mending a tear in Thomas's coat by the weak lamplight, a thought nagged at her. It came from a different life, a different world. She was the daughter of a sailmaker from Gloucester, Massachusetts. She had spent her childhood in a workshop that smelled of canvas, tar, and salt. She knew fabric, she knew stitching, but most of all, she knew wind. Her father used to say, "Wind is a thief. It doesn't just push a boat, it steals the heat right out of the sailcloth." He'd taught her how wind behaves, how it finds every weakness, how it gains power when funneled, and how, most importantly, its greatest strength is also its greatest weakness. It has no substance. Stop its movement, and you rob it of its power. She looked at the 70 feet of open ground between her and the barn. It was a wind tunnel, a channel that was actively working against her. The problem wasn't just the cold air. The problem was the moving cold air. Wind doesn't just chill you. It strips heat directly from any warm surface through a process called convection. A 30-mile-per-hour wind at 0 degrees doesn't feel like 0. It feels like 30 below. It was stripping the heat from her body, and it was robbing her cabin of its warmth every single time the door opened. Her plan formed that night. It was simple in concept, radical in execution. She couldn't stop the winter. She couldn't stop the cold. But what if she could stop the wind? What if she could create a zone of still, dead air between the house and the barn? The air in that zone would be cold, yes, but it would be calm. And calm air, even cold, calm air, is a decent insulator. Moving air is a heat thief. The opportunity came in late August. A military surplus auction in town was selling off old canvas from army tents and truck tarpaulins. It was heavy, waterproofed canvas, stained and patched, but incredibly strong. Nobody wanted it. Ranchers used wood and tin. Anna bought 3 massive rolls of it for $12. It was a huge gamble, nearly all the cash she had left, but she trusted the feel of the material. It was the same grade her father had used for storm sails. Her build began in September as the first cold snap reminded everyone what was coming. First, she used a post-hole digger to set a line of sturdy cedar posts, about 8 feet apart on either side of the path to the barn. They stood only 4 feet high. Neighbors assumed she was building a long, low fence. Then came the part that baffled everyone. She went into the woods with an axe and a small saw, and came back with dozens of young, flexible ash saplings. For days, she soaked them in the stock tank, weighing them down with rocks. When they were pliable, she began bending them into arches, fastening them to the tops of the opposing cedar posts. She now had a long, ribbed skeleton, like the hull of an overturned boat, stretching from her back door to the barn door. It was only about 6 feet high at its peak and maybe 5 feet wide. Now, here's what made this actually brilliant. This was where her sailmaker's knowledge came into play. She didn't just drape the canvas over the frame. She laid the first massive sheet, pulling it taut with a block and tackle rig she fashioned herself and anchored to the corner of the barn. She didn't use nails that would tear the fabric. She sewed loops of leather onto the edges of the canvas and lashed them to the posts with rope, using knots designed to tighten under strain. She overlapped the next sheet by 3 feet, stitching the seam with a sailmaker's palm and needle, using heavy waxed thread. The seam was waterproof and stronger than the canvas itself. She was creating a single, continuous, tensioned membrane. The curved shape was intentional. A flat roof holds snow. A curved roof, if the angle is right, helps shed it. A flat wall fights the wind. A curved wall allows the wind to flow over and around it with less resistance, reducing the overall force on the structure. She was building it less like a house and more like a sail designed to manage, not resist, immense pressure. She framed out simple wooden doorways at each end, fitting them snugly to the cabin and barn walls. The doors themselves were simple canvas flaps, weighted at the bottom, with a length of chain sewn into the hem. Easy to push through with an armload of wood, and they fell shut on their own. Every hour she worked, she was explaining the physics of survival to herself and to the landscape. The tunnel wasn't meant to be warm. It was a convective break, an airlock. The air inside would be cold, but it would be still. The difference is staggering. Air at 0 degrees with a 30-mile-per-hour wind will cause frostbite in under 30 minutes. Air at 0 degrees with no wind is just cold. You can work in it. You can exist in it. It doesn't feel like an attack. The final element was ventilation, another thing a sailor understands. A sealed space creates condensation. She cut 2 small hooded vents high up at each end, covered with fine mesh, allowing just enough air exchange to keep the interior bone dry without creating a draft. It was the same principle as ventilating a ship's hold. From the outside, it looked like a barn had eaten a house. It was bizarre. A long, white, segmented tube connecting the 2 most important buildings on her small homestead. The whole project took her nearly 6 weeks of relentless labor, squeezed in between the daily chores of a single mother on a struggling farm. The total cost was under $20. The $12 for the canvas, a few dollars for rope and posts, and the rest was her own labor and materials sourced from her land. When it was finished, she stood back and looked at it. Thomas came out and stood beside her. He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of awe and worry. "It's like a secret passage, Mama." Anna just nodded, her face grim. She knew what was coming. That evening, her late husband's brother, Frank, rode over from his ranch 5 miles down the valley. He was a good man, but a conventional one, a man who trusted what he could see and what had been done before. He looked at the canvas tunnel, then back at Anna, his face etched with concern. "Anna," he said, his voice low, "people are going to think you've lost your mind." She looked at the tunnel, then back at him, her expression unreadable. Let them. And when neighbors saw it, they didn't see engineering. They saw fear. They saw a woman's folly. The ridicule started before the first snow. It began subtly, a sideways glance at the trading post, conversations that would stop when she approached. But it didn't stay subtle for long. The first direct challenge came from Marcus Thorne. Thorne was the most successful rancher in the valley. He'd built his own large house and massive barn with his own hands, and people respected his judgment on all things practical. He ran the local sawmill and had supplied the lumber for half the structures in the county. He rode over one afternoon in early November, his horse kicking up dust from the cold, hard ground. He dismounted and walked the length of the tunnel, tapping the taut canvas with his knuckles. He shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Olson," he began, his voice not unkind, but heavy with authority, "I respect a person's right to try things, but this won't work." Anna stood on her porch, her arms crossed. She waited. "This canvas," he continued, gesturing with a gloved hand, "will get brittle in the deep cold. The first real wind we get, a 70-mile-an-hour gust, it's going to shred like paper. And the snow, we get wet, heavy snows here. A foot of it will weigh tons. It'll collapse this frame, and you'll have a mess on your hands. You've wasted your money and your time." His objection was technical, specific. It sounded reasonable. Anna's response was quiet, almost a whisper on the wind. "Perhaps." Thorne looked at her, clearly expecting an argument, an explanation. When none came, he just shook his head again, a look of pity on his face. "Well, don't say you weren't warned." He mounted his horse and rode off. The expert had delivered his verdict. The public verdict came a week later at the trading post. Anna was there to buy flour and salt. A group of ranch hands were warming themselves by the pot-bellied stove. One of them, a loud, rough man named Jed, saw her come in. He smirked and spoke loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "Hey, boys, look, it's the widow with the canvas caterpillar. Heard you're scared of a little breeze, Mrs. Olson." The men around the stove chuckled. The store went quiet. Anna felt every eye on her. Her face burned with humiliation, but she kept her expression neutral. She walked to the counter, made her purchases without a word, and walked out. The name stuck. From then on, her home was known as the Caterpillar Ranch. It wasn't a compliment. The gossip network was merciless. Women at the church quilting circle would whisper about that poor Olson woman, how she was clearly not coping with her grief. Men riding past her property would stop, point, and laugh. The story grew with each telling. She was terrified of the outdoors. She was trying to build a fortress. She was lazy, trying to get out of bundling up for chores. The pressure came home through her son. Thomas came home from the one-room schoolhouse with his lip split. Some older boys had been teasing him about their worm house. Thomas had fought back. As Anna cleaned the cut on his face, he looked at her with wide, worried eyes. "Mama, why is our house funny?" "It's not funny, Thomas," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the anger and hurt she felt. "It's just different, and people are sometimes afraid of different." The institutional skeptic arrived in the form of Mr. Abernathy, the county extension agent. He was a man who lived by government pamphlets and agricultural bulletins. He drove up in his Ford Model T, a clipboard in his hand. He was polite, but his concern was obvious. "Mrs. Olson," he said, peering at the structure through his spectacles. "I have to say, this isn't in any manual I've ever seen. My concern is primarily structural integrity under snow load and also potential for moisture buildup. This is highly unconventional." "I understand," Anna said. "I may have to file a report noting it as a potential hazard," he added, making a note on his clipboard. "I'd feel better if you had a clear path in case of collapse." "I'll keep the path clear," she replied evenly. The cut that went deepest, though, came from family. Her brother-in-law, Frank, visited again just after the first real snowfall. He sat at her kitchen table, turning his hat over and over in his hands, unable to meet her gaze. "Anna," he said finally, I came to make an offer. I'll buy the place from you for a fair price. You can take the boy and go back east. Be with your people. This is no life for you." "This is our home, Frank," she said. He finally looked at her, his face full of genuine, painful concern. "It's not about that. It's what people are saying. They see this thing out there, and they draw conclusions. They're going to think you're either scared or incompetent. Maybe both. A woman alone can't afford that reputation out here. It's not safe. People won't help you if they don't respect you." This was the heart of it. It wasn't just mockery. It was a threat to her social standing, to her very survival in a community where mutual aid was the only real insurance. She stood up and walked to the stove, pouring him a cup of coffee. Her hands were steady. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Frank. I'm trying to keep my family warm." He left soon after, his offer hanging in the air. By the beginning of December, not one person in the valley thought Anna Olson had solved anything. They thought she had built a 70-foot monument to her own fear and foolishness. They were watching, waiting for the first big storm to tear it to shreds and prove them right. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Anna Olson right. It changed how people in that valley thought about survival itself. Then December came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1922 is still recorded in Montana's climatology archives as one of the most severe in the 20th century. It didn't arrive gently. It fell off a cliff. On December the 8th, the temperature dropped to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. By December 12th, it was minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. On the morning of December 18th, the thermometer outside the trading post read minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with a relentless north wind that drove the wind chill below minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And it stayed there. For 23 consecutive days, the thermometer in the valley never once climbed above zero. The wind never stopped. It howled across the plains, sculpting snow into drifts as high as houses, burying fences, and making travel impossible. It was a siege. The valley began to break. The community's suffering was measured in specifics. Marcus Thorne, the man who had warned Anna about her canvas, was burning through 2 cords of prime, seasoned oak per month in his large, well-built house, and his family was still living in one room, huddled around the stove, to keep the temperature at a miserable 42 degrees. Getting to his own barn, a distance of 100 feet, was a brutal 5-minute battle against the wind that left him gasping and frost-nipped. The Colby Ranch down the river had a crisis with wet wood. Their hastily cut pine sizzled and steamed in the stove, producing more smoke than heat. Every pound of water in frozen wood requires over 1,000 BTUs of energy just to turn to steam before the wood can even begin to produce usable heat. They were burning wood just to dry other wood, a desperate losing battle. Their children were sick, their cabin a damp, cold 38 degrees. Other families faced different failures. The Williams family's chimney, caked with creosote from burning green wood, caught fire. They had to put it out with snow, leaving them without a fire for 12 hours until they could clear the blockage, a period during which everything liquid in their cabin froze solid. Several ranchers reported losing livestock, cows and calves, that had frozen to death in their stalls, not from the ambient temperature, but because the wind found its way through a single crack in the barn wall, creating a fatal draft. People started burning furniture, fence posts, anything that would catch fire. The daily trip for firewood became the most dangerous part of the day. And then people started noticing the Olson place, or rather, the lack of anything to notice. The mail carrier who made his rounds on a sleigh was one of the first. He told people at the trading post that the smoke coming from Anna Olson's chimney was different. It wasn't the thick, panicked plume of a stove being desperately fed around the clock. It was a thin, steady, almost lazy wisp of gray smoke. He also swore he saw her walk from the house to the barn, and she wasn't bundled like an Arctic explorer. She was just wearing a heavy coat, no scarf over her face. She disappeared into the tunnel and emerged moments later with an armload of wood, her stride unhurried. It didn't make sense. The Caterpillar Ranch, the monument to fear, looked calm. It looked efficient. While the rest of the valley was in a state of frantic, shivering crisis, the Olson place seemed to be weathering the storm with an unnerving ease. The strange canvas tunnel was still standing, its curved roof shedding the blowing snow perfectly, leaving only gentle drifts on either side. It hadn't collapsed. It hadn't shredded. Stay with me, because the number that came out of this cabin didn't just surprise the valley. It fundamentally rewrote their understanding of winter. The breaking point for Marcus Thorne came on December 23rd. He'd lost a calf the night before, and he was exhausted, his face raw from windburn. He was making a round of his neighbors, checking on the most vulnerable. He felt a grim responsibility for the widow he had publicly doubted. Loading a quarter cord of his best oak onto a sled, an act of profound charity in that desperate time, he hitched his team and made the slow, brutal trip to Anna's homestead. He expected to find her out of wood, her cabin freezing, a woman defeated. He was preparing a speech to convince her to come back with him, to abandon the failed experiment. He pulled up to the cabin, the wind nearly tearing the reins from his frozen hands. He hammered on the door. Anna opened it. The first thing that hit him was the warmth. It wasn't a blast of heat. It was a gentle, steady, deep warmth that flowed out and enveloped him. It was like stepping into a different season. He stared at her. She was wearing a simple wool dress and an apron. No coat, no shawl. Her cheeks were pink, not from cold, but from the warmth of her home. Behind her, through the cabin opening, Thorne saw a sight that stopped his breath. Her son, Thomas, was sitting at the kitchen table, reading a book. He was in his shirt sleeves. Not coats, not blankets, a cotton shirt. Thorne was so stunned he could barely speak. "Everything all right, Mrs. Olson?" he managed, his voice hoarse. "We're fine, Mr. Thorne. We're managing fine. Please, come in out of that wind." He stepped inside, and the difference was staggering. The air was warm, maybe not 70 degrees, but comfortable. And it was dry. There was no frost on the inside walls, no condensation on the window panes. He could feel the tension in his frozen shoulders begin to melt away. I brought you some wood," he stammered, gesturing back to the sled. Anna smiled, a small, genuine smile. "That's very kind of you. We have plenty, but I thank you for the thought." She gestured to her woodbox. It was 3/4 full. The tunnel makes it easy to bring in. Thorne's practical mind started doing the math, the fuel consumption. "How much are you burning?" he asked. "A little less than a cord every 3 weeks, I'd say," she replied. The words hit him like a physical blow. A cord every 3 weeks. He was burning a cord every week and a half in a bigger but better built house and was barely keeping his family from freezing. He walked over to the wall thermometer, a simple mercury one. He squinted at it in the lamplight. The mercury sat clearly and steadily at 64 degrees. 64 degrees, while the world outside was minus 38. A temperature difference of 102 degrees. This was the impossible number. It wasn't just the temperature itself. It was the combination. A comfortable 64 degrees achieved with what seemed like an impossibly low amount of fuel. Thorne, a man who trusted only what he could verify, had to understand how. "The tunnel," he said, more a statement than a question. "It keeps the wind out," Anna said simply. "When I open the door, I'm opening it into still air. The cabin doesn't lose its heat." He had to see it. He walked to the back door, Anna following. She opened it. He stepped through, out of the warm cabin and into the tunnel. The temperature dropped, certainly. It was probably 10 degrees inside the canvas structure, but the effect was profound. The roaring, screaming wind he had been fighting for weeks was gone, utterly. The silence was deafening. There was no pressure, no force, just still, cold air. He could feel his body, which had been clenched against the wind's assault, finally relax. He could breathe without the air stinging his lungs. He walked the 70 feet to the barn, his heavy boots making soft sounds on the packed snow of the path. He pushed through the canvas flap at the other end and entered the barn. It too felt different, warmer than it should be. The body heat from the 2 cows wasn't being immediately stolen by drafts. The animals were calm, chewing their cud placidly. He turned and looked back at Anna, who stood at the cabin door, silhouetted by the warm light from inside. He finally understood. He had spent his life building thick walls to fight the cold. He chinked logs, insulated with sod, built massive fireplaces, and he had missed the real enemy. He was fighting temperature. Anna was fighting heat loss. He walked back through the tunnel, the stillness inside just as shocking the second time. He stepped back into the warm cabin. He looked at the wood box, at the child reading in his shirt sleeves, at the woman in her simple dress. He, Marcus Thorne, the valley's most respected builder, had been freezing his family in a 42-degree house while burning twice the fuel. This widow, with $12 worth of surplus canvas and a sailmaker's knowledge, was living in comfort. The data was irrefutable. Thorne's ranch, 2 cords per month, 42 degrees. The Colby place, nearly 2 cords a month, 38 degrees. Anna Olson's homestead, less than 1 cord per month, 64 degrees. The difference wasn't incremental. It was categorical. Thorne stood in the middle of her cabin for a long moment. Then he looked at Anna, his face stripped of all pride, all authority. All that was left was a raw, stunned respect. He spoke 2 sentences, his voice quiet but clear. "I was wrong," he said. "We've been fighting the wrong enemy for 50 years. It wasn't just about comfort. It was about dignity. Thomas could do his schoolwork without his fingers going numb. Anna could cook a meal without wearing 3 layers of clothes. They could sleep through the night without waking up to feed a ravenous stove. The system didn't just keep them from freezing. It turned winter from something to be survived into something to be lived through." A few days later, after the worst of the storm broke, Mr. Abernathy, the extension agent, made his rounds, documenting the storm's impact. He arrived at Anna's place expecting to record a failure. Instead, he found Marcus Thorne there, helping Anna reinforce a corner post. Thorne called him over, his tone urgent. Abernathy entered the cabin with a calibrated thermometer on his clipboard. He saw the same scene Thorne had, the comfortable warmth, the child in normal clothes. He measured the temperature himself. 63 degrees. He checked Anna's meticulous logbook, where she recorded daily temperatures and her wood consumption. The numbers were clear. She was achieving a level of efficiency that, according to his government bulletins, was impossible. He walked the tunnel himself, his face a mask of scientific curiosity, replacing skepticism. He understood immediately. The principle was sound. It was just completely outside his experience. Word spread through the valley with the speed of a prairie fire. It wasn't gossip anymore. It was news. Marcus Thorne, the ultimate authority on building, was telling everyone who would listen that Anna Olson's canvas tunnel wasn't folly. It was genius. He described the feeling of stepping out of the wind, the calm inside the tunnel, the staggering efficiency of her fuel use. The story of the widow's canvas caterpillar was retold, this time with awe instead of ridicule. The first convert was a practical man. Daniel Miller, a neighbor whose farm was in a particularly wind-scoured hollow, had nearly lost his wife to pneumonia that winter. He'd spent miserable weeks fighting his way to his barn, his woodpile dwindling to almost nothing. In late March, as the snows began to melt, he rode over to Anna's place, his hat in his hands. He didn't ask for permission. He asked for instruction. "Mrs. Olson," he said, "could you show me how you stitched those seams?" Anna spent a day with him, showing him the sailmaker's knots, explaining the importance of tension and the curve of the roof. Miller didn't have access to large sheets of canvas, so he improvised. He built a cruder, shorter version using stitched-together grain sacks, waterproofed with pine tar. It was ugly, but it was functional. By the next winter, Daniel Miller's family was warmer than they had ever been. He told everyone that the Olson Tunnel had saved them. The idea, now proven and endorsed, began to spread. 7 families built tunnels that spring. 12 more followed over the summer. By the following winter, 19 homesteads in the valley had a canvas, or burlap, or even hide-covered walkway connecting house and barn. They became known as Olson Tunnels, or windbreaks. Each was a variation on the theme, adapted to the builder's materials and needs. But the core principle was the same. Stop the wind, stop the heat loss. Mr. Abernathy, the extension agent, did more than just approve. He became the official documenter. He spent days with Anna, measuring wind speeds inside and outside the tunnel, calculating heat loss differentials, and documenting fuel savings. He published a bulletin the following year through the State Agricultural College, titled "The Convective Heat Loss Interrupter, a Practical Application for Plains Homesteads." It detailed the design and the astonishing data. It credited Anna Olson by name. The idea spread beyond the valley. Articles referencing Abernathy's bulletin appeared in farming journals across the northern plains. Homesteaders in the Dakotas, Nebraska, and even Saskatchewan, Canada, started building their own versions. They adapted the design, using sod, scrap lumber, or willow wattle, but the curved roof and the core idea of an enclosed, unheated but windless corridor remained. What Anna Olson had built in 1921 out of necessity and memory anticipated by nearly a century what modern building scientists would call an Arctic entryway or an unconditioned vestibule. It was a low-tech, high-efficiency solution to a deadly problem. Years later, when her son Thomas was grown and the valley was dotted with her tunnels, a reporter from a state newspaper came to interview her. He asked if she felt proud of her invention. Anna, then in her 60s, just shook her head. She was sitting on her porch, looking out at the land that had almost broken her. "It's not new," she said, her voice still quiet after all those years. Sailors have always known the wind is a thief. I just built a house that remembered it. The original tunnel stood for over 40 years, the canvas patched and repatched until the main cabin was finally retired. But the principle it proved never went away. The frontier didn't reward stubbornness or tradition. It didn't care about what people thought was normal. It rewarded what worked. Anna Olson faced down ridicule, not with arguments, but with competence. She didn't need to say, "I told you so." The quiet warmth of her home and the comfort of her family spoke for her, a silent, irrefutable vindication that echoed across the plains. Drop a comment and let us know. Where are you watching from? What's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? Subscribe for more stories of forgotten wisdom and practical genius. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions of frontier engineering. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, created to illustrate the principles and challenges of the time. The techniques themselves are based on real historical practices of adaptation and survival on the North American frontier.